Hello, I'm Stephen, and this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. Welcome, my countercultural friends, to another tale from the underground, from the other side. If you're interested in all that we do, you can check us out at bureauoflostculture.com. Got some interesting events coming up and all sorts of other goodies in 2024. In our recent survey about what our countercultural community likes to listen to, right up there at the top was all testimonies and stories from the 1960s and 70s. So as we've been jumping around a little recently in all sorts of strange other subjects, I thought it might be quite good to return to the heart, as it were, of the counterculture for this episode. And there's very few people alive could do it better than my guest today. But before I come to that, I wanted to say thanks to Nigel. He suggested a while back, actually now, that we could do a programme about Here and Now, or Gong, Steve Hillage and Penny Rumbo. That's a great idea. Judy suggested the artist, journalist and countercultural figure Caroline Coon. That's interesting. I have been trying to get Caroline for some time. I'm very keen to record her stories, but she has proved elusive. Let's put it that way. We shall keep trying. James suggested Eric Burdon and the Animals. Another very interesting story. Eric Burdon's life is particularly interesting. I'm going to work on that one too. If you've got any suggestions, do write to us and let us know. It's always good to hear from friends. But now, back to today, or should I say, back to the 60s. He wrote a book called In the 60s, and then one called In the 70s, and he's hard at work on one called In the 80s. He is and was right at the heart of the counterculture in many roles, and the role that he's become most famous for is a writer, a biographer. He's written biographies with and of Paul McCartney, Frank Zappa, William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg. He's written books about Jack Kereouc, The Beat Hotel, Charles Bukowski, David Bowie, Bob Dylan. He's written books on the greatest album covers of all time. He's written books, of course, on the Beats, a favourite subject, and hippie, and of course the epic work which I love, which is London Calling, a story of the counterculture in this city. And boy did he live it, right at the heart of it. Meeting Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, becoming friends of both of them, setting up the Indica bookshop and gallery where John Lennon met Yoko Ono, hanging out with the Beatles and Jane Asher, setting up International Times, the Bible of the Underground, involved in the UFO Club, the Poetry Olympics at the Albert Hall, the 14-hour Technicolour Dream, all sorts of other stuff. And we hear about Paul McCartney's first hash brownie. He's our old friend, coming back to the Bureau of Lost Culture for a second, and I hope not the last time. Of course, he is Barry Miles, known affectionately to his friends as Miles. Welcome, Miles, back to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you.
Does anybody call you Barry at all?
People who don't know me, and it was purely accidental. When I went to art college, there was a college magazine, and 6 of us worked on it, and 3 of us were called Barry. So I just became Miles, and it stuck.
And it is a sort of first name as well, isn't it, Miles? So you could be called, for all we know, we could be Miles Barry.
You could.
Like John Barry and Miles.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Or Miles Davis.
Miles, in the intro there, I did list just a few of the over 70 books that you've published. Right at the centre of that bibliography is the counterculture. We're going to try and get through your life in the counterculture in less than 60 minutes.
Okay.
But I wanted just to take you back, because I thought, what's the first book that Miles published? And certainly it wasn't the first book that you published, but you described it as the first real book that you published, which was your biography of Ginsberg.
Yeah.
I thought, we'll come back to that. But in fact, your publication record goes back to much earlier, to 1956, when you published something called The Old Canal in the magazine of Cirencester Grammar School of summer of 1956 by B. Miles from Form 2B.
2B.
I love it. I actually remember the publication of The Old Canal.
Yes, I mean, it was the school magazine, and I was encouraged by my English teacher to write something for it. And it was about the Thames and Severn Canal, which had been abandoned, I think, before the war, but it was still there, and the lock gates were all overgrown, and it was a very there was an atmosphere surrounding it that I tried to describe, but what the piece was like, I can't remember. I obviously haven't seen it for 50, 60 years or so, but when my archives went to the British Library, it went there.
So you were a schoolboy at in Cirencester, which for anybody who doesn't know is in Gloucestershire, I guess.
It is indeed.
West of England. Quite a nice posh town, isn't it, Cirencester?
Well, we were out in the country, next to a farm. Right. It was a sort of 20-minute walk into town. Right. I mean, Cirencester was very much divided right down the middle by there was the Bathurst family who owned Cirencester Great Park, which literally is like a sort of slice of cake that cuts right into the centre, right up to the central church. So there's no way of actually walking around Cirencester. So there's that whole hunt and shoot and fishing kind of gang, then there were the sort of rural proletariat like me. Really.
The rural proletariat. What sort of significance to me is that was the beginning, in a way, wasn't it, of your of your route of publication? And jumping on to 1960, you edited and contributed something called The Cheltenham, and in it, and I thought this might be quite significant, you published 2 poems, one of which was called A Cut-Up.
Oh, God, really?
And I thought...
Really? A cut-up?
Yeah, you called it a cut-up, and I thought...
Well, that was quick, wasn't it? Because, I mean, cut-ups were only invented just about then.
So, what is a cut-up, for anybody who doesn't know? It's quite significant in this story.
Is something that William Burroughs and Brian Gyson popularised in a book called Minutes to Go, which... One day in 1958, Brian Gyson, who was an artist, was cutting mounts for his drawings with a Stanley knife on a big pile of newspapers, and he cut through the newspapers, of course, with the knife. And then, as he was taking the mount off, he realised that you could read through these different layers of newspapers, and they made just as much sense, if not more sense, by this random cut-up. So he started to basically slice through copies of Time magazine and Life and everything. And then when Burroughs came back to the Beat Hotel, this was in the Beat Hotel in Paris, Bill immediately recognised its potential as a literary technique and called it a project for disastrous success. And he, of course, made it his own. And he realised, of course, the better the material you start with, then the better the cut-up. So he, immediately got a hold of Rimbaud and Saint Jean Perse and T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and cut all of those up. And the results were very interesting, and published in this little book called Minutes to Go, along with Brian Gyson's Permutations.
And then, of course, later on, he started to apply the same technique with tape, didn't he? He started doing cut-ups on tape.
Well, once you've done that, you can move on to anything. And there were several films made by Anthony Balch using the cut-up technique. Burroughs rather disastrously, in fact, eventually applied it to people, not believing their normal persona, but trying to investigate who they were influenced by and whatever control systems were at work manipulating them. Which kind of alienated most of his friends.
Right. Not surprisingly. Well, we will talk more about him because he was one of your friends, wasn't he? And we did a little exhibition together a few years ago of Burroughs in London. Right back in 1960, you published this poem yourself called The Cut-Up. So I think that's, even if you can't remember what it was.
I'm astonished, actually, that it was published at all, because I saw Burroughs and Gyson do a performance at the ICA on Dover Street, but I was then only 17 or 18 or something, and far too shy to approach these terrifying avant-garde figures. So it wasn't until about a few years later, anyway, that I met them.
Do you remember the impact that had on you at Dover Street, then, actually seeing them perform?
Oh yes, I mean, because as an art student, I'd studied Dada and surrealism and everything, and I was very conscious of how wonderful it must have been to be at the Cabaret Voltaire, for instance, in Zurich, and see the beginnings of Dada. And to me, this was an amazing new approach to literature. Because after all, I mean, I'd gone to Cirencester Grammar School, where the most recent thing we read, I think, was Siegfried Sassoon's Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man. So no, absolutely no modern literature at all had ever. Here is people doing crazy stuff. Really wonderful. I loved it.
By 1963, when you were at Gloucestershire College of Art, published something called How to Undress a Painting, which is a great title.
I don't even remember that, but that's great. Was it any good?
I don't know. I didn't actually read it.
It was at art school. We were all pretentious bastards, strutting about, thinking we knew everything. But we were just teenagers. I was only 16 when I went to art college.
Right.
I knew nothing about anything. That's what teenagers are like. We make big manifestos and proclamations.
But I feel like there's a sort of little signposts along the way, because also, I remember you told me before once that actually you had the sort of courage to actually write to one of your heroes and get a response, didn't you?
I wrote to Ferlinghetti, yes, in City Lights, because I was editing a little college magazine at the art college. And I wanted to see if he would send us some poems. And indeed, none of the books had been published in Britain, so that was a perfectly reasonable thing. And we maintained a small correspondence. He was very generous, was Lawrence. And then later on I met him, of course, in 1965 when he came to London and was at the Albert Hall. And in fact, he stayed with me for a week or so. And I got to know him quite well.
Right, so this is Lawrence Ferlinghetti, beat poet, friend of Ginsberg,
yes,
and Kereouc, etc.
He published Howl by Ginsberg, and that made the book famous because it was busted for obscenity. And his bookshop, City Lights, became the main publisher for the Beat generation. He published everybody from Gary Snyder to Kereouc to Ginsberg, of course, Bob Kaufman. Loads and loads of people.
Because that also became a theme later, didn't it? Which I remember you told me when you were at IT, International Times, that there was this kind of unspoken agreement with all the kind of independent free press across the West that you could reprint each other's.
Well, there was a conference. Basically, it was the establishment of the Underground Press Syndicate.
Right.
And the principles of that were that if you were a member of the UPS, you could reprint from any other UPS publication. So if we did an interview or an article that somebody else particularly liked, they could just use it. They didn't have to go through all the hassle of writing a letter or trying to get through on the phone or something. Really, all these little newspapers that were done for, on no money at all had access to a huge pool of material, which grew very big in the end. Literally hundreds of them, actually, by the end of the 60s. And early 70s. The principle being that we were doing this to get the information out,
right?
Not to make money or
not
anything.
Not to make money, but so just to sort of backpedal a bit to you then. So you were at Gloucester College of Art, and then you come to London. So just walk us through that, why you decided to come here.
After my 4 years of art college, and I have a degree in painting. It's about the most useless degree you can get, So I came out to London. I did a year at the University of London and got a teaching degree. So I could teach up to and including art college. I'd always wanted to get to. I'm not a country person. I don't like the country. I'm as urban as you could.
Deep in the heart of Fitzrovia to this day, right? When you came, just give us a little picture of London at the time.
When I first came to London, I hitchhiked around the south coast with a friend of mine from school. Literally with a copy of On the Road in our pocket, and slept in haystacks and barns. And we got to London, and I knew that Soho was supposed to be the cool place to hang out. Hung out at the Partisan, which was a coffee shop where folk singers and radical activists, there were people playing chess, men with beards, coffee in glass cups and with brown sugar. You can't imagine how amazing this was.
A bit of skiffle playing in the background?
A bit of skiffle, and folk singers who would sing with their finger in their ear. Right. I've never been quite sure why they do that, but a lot of them used to do it. And then, of course, that closed, and we realised, where are we going to sleep? But you can't really sleep rough in the middle of Soho. Anyway, we hadn't eaten, and there used to be an Italian restaurant on Carlisle Street, just off Soho Square, La Rocca, I think it was. We went in there and had a cheap meal, because in those days you could have a decent spaghetti bolognese for about 1 and 3pence.
15p or something. Yeah.
About 15p, yeah. Anyway, the waitress took a shine to us. I don't think it was any sexual thing. If it was, they didn't make that. I'd never even heard of homosexuality at that point. And they let us sleep in the basement. So we unrolled our sleeping bags in the basement of La Rocca. And so my first night in London was spent just off Soho Square. So to me, that's always been the centre of the world, or at least the British world. I always wanted to live as close as possible to there. And indeed, I'm about 10 minutes walk away at the moment, and have been for I think 1963 I first moved into the building. In 64.
You've been in your building since
building
64?
that long, yeah.
Wow, okay. So when you came back, as it were, professionally, when you didn't need to sleep on the floor in the basement of the Rocker?
By then I had a girlfriend, and we had to go to Scotland to get married because her parents wouldn't let us live together. Got married by people who were so far outside normal society. They insisted on using their own ink that they'd made to sign the register. One was in full Highland gear, complete with a claymore and a dirk and all the rest of it, and very long hair, which in those days was almost completely unknown. And another one who was known as the Rubber Man, who had about 3 meters of rubber piping wrapped around him, and he would stick a little mouthpiece in one end and a sibsy in the other, and he would fire up some hash, and then he would huff and puff for ages, and eventually the smoke would go round and round and get nice and cool, and it would suddenly hit him though, and he would kind of explode in a great cloud of smoke and sort of virtually fall over. Again, it was sort of incredibly impressive to a teenager like me. I thought, this is the life, this is much better than all these guys who were talking about fox hunting all the time.
Sure. Of course, Soho at the time, however glamorous it might appear to a teenager, it was a very different place than it is now.
It was seedy as hell. I mean, there were a lot of strip clubs, and it's basically an Italian neighbourhood still. So a large percentage of the population ran proper shops. I mean, in those days, there were, I think, 6 butchers down Old Compton Street alone, as well as Fens that dealt in nothing but game. There was La Roche who sold nothing but French vegetables that came over 3 times a week. So it was like being on the continent, really, rather than in Britain. A kind of a community that you don't normally find in Britain, I think. I didn't realise that at the time, but people were so friendly and nice, and they clearly had a bad time during the war, which wasn't that much earlier, after all. And there were a lot of guys around who were shell-shocked or crazy, or just suffering from whatever horrors they'd seen during World War II. And of course there were lots of bomb sites in those days, And then there were all the prostitutes and people. A bit later on, in 1965, I used to work at Joseph Poole, my first bookshop job, and one of the guys there doubled up as a stage manager at one of the strip clubs, the Phoenix on Old Compton. And when he went on holiday, I took over his job for a week. That really brought home the grim reality, should we say, of Soho, because these girls were working in about 5 different strip clubs. Some of them had kids, when they were stripping, the girls backstage would look after them. They'd all run away from home. They all came from really dysfunctional families. A lot of them had kind of guys who were not really pimps, but just sort of living off of them. And then one of them, a week after I'd done that, actually leapt out of the top window of the building and killed herself. I mean, it was just, that's what it was really like. It wasn't like all the glamorous magazines and shit, So, on the other hand, there was a community and a comradeship in Soho that I've always treasured, really, I mean, most of them are now dead, of course, but it was good.
Tell us about the journey to Better Books and what Better Books was, actually, because this is another milestone, isn't it, along the way for you?
Yes, well, I was. There was this bookshop called Better Books that Tony Godwin had started in 1947, I think, which was very much the centre for the angry young men, Osborne and Wesker and all these people who wrote social realist plays and novels and so on. Tony had a rather idealised view of how writers and artists should be. For instance, he had little desks with typewriters in the basement that novelists or poets could, if they felt inspired, would go down and the muse would lead them, and they would write a few pages or something, a 2-page novel or something. Well, of course, what really happened was somebody like Alex Trocky, the notorious junkie, would go down there. When he came up, his shirt was bulging with books, because that was, of course, is where all the overstock and everything was kept. So they were getting very much ripped off by book thieves. Tony also, he was then the chief editor at Penguin Books, working on 2 jobs at once, really. So he hardly ever came into the shop. And I used to hang out there a lot. And then Bill Butler had been the manager of the paperback section, but his boyfriend had TB, I think it was, and they moved to Brighton, and I just took over his job. I was still very young. I was only 23 or something, 22. And I carried on the tradition of poetry readings and film shows and stuff. You
and
know,
Ferlinghetti had already got this connection with.
there was a connection with Ferlinghetti. We used to swap boxes and boxes and boxes of penguins, and we would ship them over to City Lights in San Francisco. And City Lights books were printed in Britain, and we would just do a swap, and then we would have all the City Lights poetry. It wasn't all Beats. It was a very good arrangement. And then by then I had started to meet up with the New York kind of underground scene through a woman called Betsy Klein, who came over, who was the girlfriend of Ken Weaver, who was the drummer with the Fugs. And Ken was living in the back of the Peace Eye bookshop on Tompkins Square in New York. And the Peace Eye was run by Ed Saunders, who was the lead singer with the Fugs. And so between the connection with those people, I started to import books from New York, which was all the mimeograph magazines that were coming out then, Lines and Fuck You, a Magazine of the Arts, and Mother, and filled with Beat Generation writers, and just in very small runs, usually mimeographed.
Here is a sidebar. Mel's mentioned mimeographing. A mimeograph machine, sometimes called a stencil duplicator, was a low-cost duplicating machine that worked by forcing ink through a stencil onto paper. Mimeographs, along with spirit duplicators and hectographs, were common technologies for printing small quantities of documents. Stencil duplicating in its earliest form was invented in 1874, almost a century before the time we're talking about, by Eugenio de Sugato, a young Italian studying law in London. He called his device a papyrograph. And his system involved writing on a sheet of varnished paper at that time with special caustic ink which ate through the varnish and paper, leaving holes where the writing had been. And this sheet, which has now become a stencil, was then placed on a blank sheet of paper and the ink rolled over it so that the ink oozed through the holes, creating a duplicate on the second sheet. In 1891, David Gestetner painted his automatic cyclostyle. The Gestetner machine, this features a lot in countercultural publications, basically took Zaccato's system and added a roller. So it provided for more automation, faster reproductions, since the pages could be produced and moved by rollers instead of pressing one sheet at a time. To create a stencil, again, the operator would load a stencil assemblage into a typewriter instead of paper, use a switch on the typewriter to put it in stencil mode, and then when you tap the keys, they would strike the stencil directly, displacing the coating and making the tissue paper permeable to oil-based ink. Now, early fanzines, political pamphlets, and short-run low-fi magazines and newspapers, as Miles mentioned, including the Soho Bibles that we've covered on this show, were printed by mimeograph or Gestetners, because the machines and supplies were widely available and inexpensive, and they became an important part of countercultural spread of ideas and information. But, of course, in the late 60s and continuing to 70s, photocopying gradually displaced mimeographs, Gestetners, spirit duplicators, and hectographs.
And so we were the only place probably in Europe you could buy any of that stuff, because we would send not just penguins but books, anything to do with countercultural bohemian lifestyle, shall we say, or drugs or anything like that Ed could sell in his bookshop.
So it became a kind of centre for sort of beat and underground poetry and literature and
underground films, and underground filmmakers, Stan Brakhage and all of those people. Kenneth Anger, we showed his films. And then not too long after I joined, a guy called Bob Cobbing joined the staff, who was probably a good 20 years older than me, maybe older, and he was very keen on the readings and the poetry. He had a small press of his own. It was a terrific centre of activity, actually.
And then 1965, May, somebody called Allen Ginsberg arrives in London.
Indeed.
And offers to give free readings everywhere, right? And he gives...
Well, Allen came into Better Books, and at first he thought Bob was me. And then he found, that I was me. And he had a letter from Ed Saunders saying, if you're in London, you have to obviously look up this guy. So we got talking, and Allen had been on a kind of a world tour, really. First of all, he went to Cuba. Then he outraged them so much that they slung him out and put him on a plane to Czechoslovakia. I think the first plane was going to from Havana. So he hung out for a bit in Czechoslovakia. Then he went to Moscow. Was really having a good time in Czechoslovakia. So he went back, and he was proclaimed the King of May and paraded through the streets and with a paper crown on and everything by all the students. And then at that point, it was still a communist country then. The administration just thought, this is too much, you've got to get rid of this guy. The secret police got hold of his private notebooks, which of course were filled with thrilling things that Alan had done with a broomstick that night or something. They had plenty of grounds to sling him out, So they put him on the first plane, and that happened to be going to London.
Right.
Fortunately, though, when he was in Cuba, he'd met Tom Mashler, who was the editor-in-chief at Jonathan Cape. And so he got to London, called up Mashler, and went to stay with him in a beautiful house. But it was up in Hampstead, which, as Alan said, is like being out in Queens, which it isn't, of course. But when he and I got talking in the shop, I said, well, I only live 10 minutes walk from here. And he came to stay for, 5 weeks or something. Yeah, he was there quite a while. And one of the first things, of course, was I asked him, will you do a reading? And he said, of course. It just by word of mouth. The place was absolutely packed with people, with the front door open and a great crowd outside trying to hear. Being Alan, somehow or other, Andy Warhol was in the front row with Edie Sedgwick. You have people like Donovan was there. I mean, all the kind of scene going on in London at the time. Julie Felix, the folk singer. Who Ferlinghetti, in fact, shortly after that had a little affair with. So it was all very, incestuous and fun.
Because, you were lifelong friends, right the way up until his death. And we actually talked last time you were here, we sort of took you over to the farm and we did that whole programme about your summer on the farm with him.
Yes.
So we can leapfrog that. And, of course, next year we're going to be doing this Ginsberg in London exhibition and events together.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that.
Tell us about this thing, the International Poetry Incarnation. It's interesting as an event, but also I think we live in a time when it's difficult to imagine poetry being such a kind of radical force.
That's true. That's true. But of course, this is long before the internet or any of those things. It was at a time when poetry really was one of the main ways that the bohemian element or young people communicated, shall we say, sophisticated ideas or complicated ideas. Crept very much into music as well. The 60s was the period when rock and roll went from being just simple love songs and commercial stuff right through to very complicated rock. As I said, usually in a very deep voice, with quotation marks around it, as if it was really, heavy. I don't know what really replaced poetry, but it was enormously popular. A lot of kids going to art colleges and universities and or musicians. They often had poetry in their pocket, and poetry readings were very big. And often multimedia kind of things. It would be New Departures, for instance, run by Michael Horowitz and Pete Brown. It wasn't just people reading poetry. There were small playlets. There was sometimes a little film. Quite often there was a jazz combo that would play a few numbers. So it was right across the board, or maybe a folk singer or something. So there wasn't that kind of division in those days between the different arts. And poetry was seen as one of the primary ways of expressing ideas. We had lots of poetry readings at Better Books.
Well, Jeff Nuttall described Ginsberg reading at Better Books with you as the first healing wind on a very parched collective mind.
That's good.
After this reading at Better Books, do you make plans for this International Poetry Incarnation?
Yes. By then Alan was staying with me, so he would come into work, as it were. The room that the reading was in was used just for hanging out. It had tables and chairs and a machine that dispensed soup, coffee and tea, but it all came out of the same nozzle. So it was this kind of ghastly mixture in these awful plastic mugs that had teeth marks in there where people had chewed on them.
You might get a noodle in your tea.
Exactly. But Alan used to so hold court back there. He had the time of his life. All these sort of skinny English boys, they'd get chat up and everything. Anyway, he was there one day and we were talking, and he mentioned to a group of us that Ferlinghetti was in Paris and on his way to London. And then somebody else said that Gregory Corso was in Italy and on his way to London. And the Beats had never done a big reading in Britain. And so the first idea was a Beat Generation reading, just the three of them. Somebody said, what's the biggest venue? I think it was Barbara Rubin. I think it was my wife said the Albert Hall. And Barbara just stood up, walked over to the desk, got the Albert Hall on the phone and booked it for like 10 days' time.
In 10 days' time, right, okay.
Thought, whoa, And it cost like £400 plus £100 an hour afterwards. My wage at the time was £13 a week. I mean, right. These were sums which are so inconceivable. My friend Hoppy agreed to do the publicity. He took photographs of everybody who was going to read, and we managed to get them printed in the Sunday Times and places like that. Unfortunately, they kind of felt that maybe the English poets should be involved. Of course, they all wanted to be involved, and most of them had never done a reading anywhere bigger than the upstairs room in a pub, let alone the Albert Hall. And in the end, there were 17 people on the bill, and...
But I mean, what a lineup. You got Burroughs, Corso, Philip.
Well, Burroughs was only on tape. Nobody could really hear him. That was during the interval.
Ginsberg, Spike Hawkins, Michael Horowitz, you mentioned, Alexander Trocky.
The great thing about that reading was that the audience was quite animated and very much part of the reading. And one or two of the boxes, for instance, the curtains were drawn, and puffs of pot were coming out. We'd anticipated this, of course, and we had huge bunches of incense burning all over the place. There was one Dutch poet, Simon Winkelhoch, wasn't reading, in fact. I don't think he was on the bill as such. But anyway, he'd taken a rather strong acid trip, and he was a very tall guy, the Flying Dutchman, we used to call him. Anyway, he was charging around the hall saying, "Love, love, love," and waving his arms about. I mean, it was that kind of thing going on. And then there was a young woman that Ronnie Lang had brought along from his psychiatric institute, and she danced to people's poetry, particularly Ginsberg's, in a sort of flowing white dress. She was like, it was a bit disconcerting.
Expressive dance.
Expressive dancing, that's what it was. And there were lots of things like that went on. Yeah. And there were also events like Jeff Nuttall and another artist got covered in paint and had to be rescued, because if you block all your pores with paint, you can't breathe or something, and have to be sent to hospital.
Drown in your own skin, sort of thing.
Yes,
yeah.
John Latham was the poet. We put John naked into Sir John Barbarolli's bathtub and poured paint over him, and he was going to do something, and robots were going to parade him, I think. And the robots, of course, broke down and fell over, and that kind of stuff was going on in the periphery of all of this.
Right.
Yes.
Well, Jeff Nuttall described it. The underground was suddenly there on the surface, and you described it as a sense of constituency that was never there before. All these people recognised each other, and they all realised they were part of the same scene.
Well, that's true. Where did I write that, I wonder? And that was true, and that was what was so great about it, was that we just realised that this is a whole group of people that had no recognition anywhere, that we had no newspapers, we had no access to TV or anything, and yet it was a constituency. They didn't look like hippies yet. It was in 1965. Right. It was still short hair and ties and stuff.
Yeah. You might call it the birth of the British underground, which then kind of emerged in counterculture, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a major event, wasn't it? And then only the first of several of the kind of famous countercultural events that you worked on or helped about. But after Better Books, what happened next for you?
What did happen? 65. Towards the end of 65, Better Books was going to be sold. The new owners were going to be Hatchards of Piccadilly, which is an excellent bookshop, but very straight, and associated with the publishers of the Bible, of all things. And we just thought, no way are they going to let us put on Kenneth Anger films and that kind of thing anymore. So I thought I'd like to start my own bookshop. I got together with a guy called John Dunbar, who had been thinking of opening an avant-garde art gallery, because there were so very few of them in town, maybe 3 or something. And we decided to combine forces and have a bookshop art gallery dealing mostly in the avant-garde. But of course we had no money, either of us. John's best friend, however, was Peter Asher, who at that point was in a little duo called Peter and Gordon. And they'd had some big hits, #1 hits in Britain and America, with World Without Love and Woman and songs like that, all of which had been written by Paul McCartney. So we got Peter on board, and Peter was going to finance the bookshop art gallery. And that was terrific. So we started a company called MAD, and I started to assemble stock for the bookshop. Peter was living at home in Wimpole Street with his parents. Also living at home was his sister, Jane Asher, who was going out with Paul McCartney, And Paul was living at home. He had the little attic room at the top next to Peter's.
In the same house as their parents?
Yes.
Wow.
And Jane was only about 17 or something. But and on her bedroom door, it said Jane in sort of 8-year-old writing. It was absolutely wonderful. So
on his bedroom door it said Paul.
It said Paul, but yes, much more modern writing. I mean, what's not to like? There he is. He's got Mrs. Asher cooking lovely food for him. He's got his girlfriend on the floor below.
Cool brother in the next room.
Yes, where he kept all his tape recorders and stuff. Right. Peter's room was an L-shaped room, panelled in Norwegian wood, as a matter of fact. It's all
starting to make sense. McCartney also is an important part in your story with the biographies as well, isn't it? 65. So actually, the Beatles already a kind of global phenomenon.
Oh God, yeah.
But in a kind of pop rock sort of thing. Yeah. Then they come to London. So McCartney's now getting involved in what would become the counterculture, and in fact ended up paying for quite a bit of it as well, didn't he? So, in 65 you also introduced Paul McCartney to hash brownies, I heard.
Oh, yes. Well, it wasn't me, you see. It was my wife. And she was making Alice B. Toklas's famous recipe for hash brownies. Happened to mention it to Paul one day that she'd knocked up a batch of these. A couple of days later, I came home from Better Books and to find Paul sitting on the draining board in the kitchen, with Sue. I don't think Sue had ever been so sorry to see me. Yeah, so that's where he had his first hash brownies.
Right, so if you want to know, listeners, how the Beatles moved from Love Me Do to the White Album, you can blame Miles and his wife.
By living in the Asher household, Paul was introduced to a different lifestyle altogether than his previous one in Liverpool, because the Ashers were upper middle class, very professional family. Margaret Asher taught music at I forget which college, Royal College of Music, or one of those. She taught George Martin, in fact, who became the Beatles' producer. Right. And she taught Paul how to play the recorder, so on The Fool on the Hill, that's him playing that.
Is that right?
That she had taught him how to do.
Right.
And then Jane, of course, was a child star and had been in films and television ever since she was about 7 or 8. And so was Peter. And the whole family, in fact, were engaged in media. The younger sister also lived there. And Claire was in a daily soap opera on BBC called Mrs. Dale's Diary. Peter was in Jennings at school.
Public schoolboy.
Started off as Jennings, and then I think he was switched to somebody else. Derbyshire, I think, his name, for the rest of the series, which went on for years.
Right. For Paul McCartney, it was a kind of entree into a different kind of world, right? Because from a very working-class Liverpool background.
And then there's Jane introducing him to all these Hollywood producers, going to premieres and stuff. So he was already moving in a very, very different circle. And of course, he was the one who chose to stay in London, whereas the other three Beatles all went out to the stockbroker belt and had big mansions and tried to live that kind of life, which none of them really did that successfully, really. I mean, I think Paul had a much better time staying in the centre of town, even though he was living in a tiny little attic room. Yeah,
so they'd get chauffeur-driven in their roles. Like he was actually living life in the middle of London.
Yeah, well, he did have an Aston Martin, actually, but parked round the corner in the Mews,
Well, when quite organically you find yourself at the sort of centre of, the so-called swinging 60s, don't you? In communication and socialising and doing work with these people, including McCartney, beat poets.
Well, and through Paul, of course, I met all the others. John used to come over all the time, and when I would be sorting books in the basement before the shop opened, before Indica opened, John and Paul would be sitting at the piano, writing songs. I mean, looking back, it's absurd how privileged I was to see all this kind of stuff, and I didn't make any notes or anything.
Didn't have your tape recorder with you?
I did not have a tape recorder with me. No.
But let's talk about Indica, because Indica becomes one of the hubs for the counterculture as it emerges, doesn't it? And of course, for John Lennon, becomes very significant later, doesn't it? The gallery, anyway. Tell us about that.
So we opened a bookshop and art gallery. The gallery was in the basement and basically a white cube, which is what you need for an art gallery. But a bookshop is always messy. There's always stuff everywhere, big piles of books and magazines. I remember John Lennon coming in one day, for instance, and we had an old busted settee in the middle of the room. And I gave him a copy of Tim Leary's book, The Psychedelic Experience. Right. And of course, he just opened it more or less at random, and it just said, turn off your mind, drift downstream and so on. He's, I love this, He got quite a lot of stuff out of that. Then we decided to open a separate bookshop over on Southampton Row. Leave the gallery in Mason's Yard, just off Piccadilly, and moved most of the art upstairs into the ground floor. And it was on the ground floor of Indica Gallery that Yoko Ono had her first European show. It may have even been her first gallery show, I'm not sure, because she used to do mainly studio stuff in New York. And I was in touch with her in Metrobooks days because I used to buy copies of Grapefruit from her, which she had self-published. And she was also a member of the Fluxus group, and we used to sell all of their things. So then when Gustav Metzger organised the Destruction in Art Symposium, 1966 I suppose, he brought her over to take part. So I was one of the people she looked up, just because I'd been corresponding with her and had obviously had contacts in the kind of area that she worked in. I introduced her to John, who ran the gallery, John Dunbar. John was very flexible. These days, if you put on a show, you have to plan it like 2 years ahead or something. But he could get one on in 2 months. And so she arranged to have her show. When we were hanging the show, John Lennon showed up, a chauffeur-driven Mini. He only dropped by really to take drugs with John Dunbar, because they
drug buddies.
Like most of these rock and roll bands, maybe, I don't know whether it's changed, but in those days you couldn't be friends with all of them. Each one had their own entourage, and I was very much part of Paul's circle, but John Dunbar was very much part of John Lennon's circle. We saw each other, went to clubs and stuff together, but that's kind of how it panned out. John Lennon and John Dunbar were having a good time, and John got Yoko to show Lennon around the show. And at one point he had to climb up a stepladder and look through a magnifying glass which was hanging from a chain to read a little label stuck on the ceiling. You can imagine these days, health and safety allowing that one. Anyway, John climbed up, and he thought it would say "fuck off" or something, but it didn't. It just said yes, and he was very pleased with that. They kind of clicked, but not in a sexual way. She pretty much stalked him, to be quite honest, for 2 years before they finally got together. But that was the meeting, and that's the one that they always refer to, both of them in interviews.
The beginning of a very long story, right?
A very long story, yes. And we also showed other people, the Boyle family, Lillian Lynn, and people like that. But John was very pleased to say that he never actually had a painting on the wall throughout the whole history of Indica. It was always op art or some kind of installations.
But two of the Beatles in already there, and we should mention your old friend, long lamented John Hopkins.
Just after the Albert Hall reading, Hoppy and I were discussing this sort of constituency and how they had no vehicle for news or information of interest to them. So we'd seen the Village Voice, of course, and then the East Village Other began in New York. And because of my contacts with Ed Sanders and the Fugs and everybody, I quickly became their London correspondent. So I then immediately got all of the underground press from all over America. And we thought, well, we should do an underground paper in London. We had a number of meetings, and people came up with different ideas and how to finance it. And there was a woman called Bobo Lejeune, I remember, who was apparently a society hostess in New York. She was living in Shepherd Market.
It's in the posh part of town.
Very posh part of town, just by the Hilton Hotel, just off Hyde Park. We had a meeting. Lots of silly ideas were being made about what to call it, and she just stamped across the room and just said, "Let's call it It."
It?
Yes. Right. And because it could stand for all kinds of different things. So initially... And so we did. We called it It. But we also said International Times. And then the Times, of course, immediately came on to us, a great load of lawyers, and said, you can't use International Times.
You sort of reverse engineered the word It and thought, what could that stand for?
Yeah.
International Times, great. And then what, the Times of London's can't get more establishment than that. They got up
we're really going to get mixed up, sure. Yeah, but anyway.
This is a sidebar about some of the people that Miles have mentioned, who, alas, are now dead. Many of whom I would have loved to interview for this show. Barbara Rubin was an American filmmaker and performance artist, best known for her landmark 1963 underground film, Christmas on Earth, originally titled Cocks and Cunts. It featured several painted and masked performers engaging in a variety of gay and straight sexual acts. The film's two separate black and white reels projected simultaneously, one inside the other, with colour filters placed on the projector lens, and originally an ad hoc soundtrack. Due to its explicit nature, the New York City Police tried to suppress the film for a time during the mid-60s. Barbara routinely carried around her one copy with her for safekeeping. Allen Ginsberg was so impressed by the film, he initiated an affair with her after seeing it for the first time. Pete Brown was an English performance poet, lyricist and singer, best known for his collaborations with Cream, Eric Clapton and Graham Bond. He also wrote film scripts and formed a film production company. A friend of Sid Barrett. Jeff Nuttall, another poet, performer, author, actor, teacher, painter, sculptor, jazz musician, anarchist and social commentator. Wow, that's a lot. A key part of the British 1960s counterculture, who staged some of those early happenings at Better Books and formed the People Show in 1966, one of the first and long-lasting performance art groups. My friend David worked there for many years. He also wrote Bomb Culture, a personal account of the birth of the Alternative Society. Michael Horowitz died sadly just a couple of years ago in 2021. Fled to this country from Germany, one of the Jewish families fleeing the Holocaust. A poet, editor, visual artist and translator. Very important part of the beat scene in the UK. Alexander Trocchi, a Scottish novelist who wrote many books, often under pen names, some pornographic novels. He and his friends also published Samuel Beckett and Jean Genet. His novel Cain's Book was something of a sensation, being an honest study of heroin addiction with descriptions of sex and drug use, banned in Britain. He was often deep in the throes of heroin addiction himself. He even failed to turn up at the launch party for Cain's Book. His wife, Lynn, prostituted herself on the streets of the Lower East Side to keep that habit going. He injected himself on camera during a live television debate on drug abuse. In the late 50s, he lived in Venice, California, then centre of the Southern Californian beat scene, and hung out with Leonard Cohen. Hoppy Hopkins, a very close friend of Miles, who died in 2015, British photographer, journalist, researcher and activist, probably one of the best known underground figures of swinging London in the 60s. Photographed many of the musicians of the day, including the Beatles and the Stones. Also recorded the seedier side of London that Miles mentioned earlier on, with photographs of tattoo parlours, cafes, prostitutes and fetishists in Soho. He also set up the London Free School in Notting Hill with various others. Served prison for cannabis possession in 1967, described by a judge as a pest to society. And a free hoppy movement sprang up, and as a consequence of which there was a campaign for the liberalisation of the laws on cannabis, with a letter published in the Times, a full-page ad that described the existing law as immoral in principle and workable in practice. How right that remains. Signed by all sorts of people, including Francis Crick, Jonathan Miller, the Beatles. Paul McCartney, initially clandestinely, actually arranged the funding for that advertisement as a tribute to Hoppy, at the instigation of Miles. Miles also mentioned Sue, his first wife, who was an Anglo-American counterculture activist and restaurateur. She met Miles on the annual C&D march from Aldermaston, and as Miles mentioned, they had to elope to Scotland to get married as her parents refused to accept the match. Co-founded Indica Gallery and IT. She started her cooking career by running the Cafe at the Arts Lab, and other prominent London restaurants such as Food for Thought and L'Escargot, and through the 80s became famous for her food.
We naively thought, well, we will cover everything that people of our generation was interested in. And so that included interviews with a lot of avant-garde composers, rock and roll stuff.
Artists.
But it also included the current price of pot, and how much hash was going for in Amsterdam and stuff.
And obviously what I love about reading it is I love the small ads, classifieds, They give a sort of picture of the time. The op-eds and the articles and the things, that gives a big picture of the time, but it's in the small ads that sort of, people advertising for pads and groovy chick seeks pad in central London.
That's it. It's a snapshot of the era.
It's a snapshot.
And the police, of course, read that very carefully.
Did they?
There was some poor potter down in Cornwall advertised a pug mill, which is the machine that you use to you shove clay into it and turn a handle, and the clay comes out compressed or something. And he was raided. They thought it was one of those words that meant something else.
Because he was a potter, it obviously had something to do with pot.
Pot. Right.
In its run, the British underground press, probably certainly with Oz and Friends, they're sort of one of the triumvirate, wasn't it?
So IT came first in October '66, and then I think Oz began quite shortly afterwards, in about March or something of '67, and Friends didn't start until December '69. I mean, that was a second generation really, But Oz and IT were like the Sunday papers, really. You know, Oz was the colour section, you know,
Right.
as they used to have in those days, and we were the newspaper. And Oz came out monthly, or sometimes bi-monthly, every 2 months. So they dealt much more in articles, think pieces, shall we say, although you couldn't always read them because sometimes they would be printed in green on red, and then you just
pair of 3D glasses to read them.
Not even with chemical enhancement could you read that. Whereas we came out fortnightly and covered much more immediate news. But we didn't have any reporters or anything. Nobody got paid anything except the basic staff. I mean, I never got paid at all for the first 4 years. It wasn't until much later. International Times started in the basement of Indica, and then we were there until we got raided the first time, and the police took away everything. I mean, even the phone books, everybody's address book, every piece of paper in the entire place.
With the intention of what? Just shutting you down? Or
shutting it down, basically.
And what was the pretext?
Obscenity. Apparently we'd used the word motherfucker. And somebody had objected. They kept everything for almost 3 months.
Right. So
and then they just brought a van up and threw everything downstairs. You know, I mean, had this happened in Eastern Europe, you know, it would have been all over the goddamn papers, you know, of how horrible these. But because it was the Met doing it, you know, no problem.
You think they've been gunning for you for a while, and it was a kind of statement or something, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So you guys had to move, right?
The bookshop remained as usual. They took away Naked Lounge and everything, and came back with a big grubby police fingerprints all over it. So the paper moved. Yeah, we moved to 22 Betterton Street was the first one, and then after that to Endell Street, and later on Harry Krishna's had the ground floor, in fact, and IT was just upstairs. And then when that kind of fell through for a very complicated set of problems, and then to what used to be known as Murder Alley in Soho, which is Wardour Mews. And then I moved to New York, April, I think, of 1970.
There's an awful lot going on in countercultural London, as there was in other major cities in the UK and certainly in the US and around Europe as well, right? Literary stuff, musical stuff. Obviously, drugs was part of it, new ways of thinking and spinning around you, isn't it? And in terms of lifestyle, you were married with Sue, right, your wife. Well, there's this famous saying about the 60s, you know, if you can remember it, you weren't there. But there's another saying, which is, you didn't have to remember it because Miles wrote it all down.
Well, I only wrote it down later.
You were an observer even then, though, weren't you? I mean, how much did you get involved? Like, were you also taking acid? And
there was no time.
There was no time, right?
No. I did visit Tim Leary in Millbrook in 67 and later on in Berkeley and other places he lived, and he became a bit of a friend. No, there was no time for any of that. I mean, I was overextended in a stupid way because it's. And it was not like there was any money in any of it. Most of the things I was doing, I wasn't getting paid for at all. I just really did have a rather naive belief that we could change society. Because Britain in those days was such a monoculture, just one way of life. And if you deviated from it even slightly, they came down on you like a ton of bricks. I mean, on Sunday morning, for instance, they would chain up the swings in the park so children couldn't even have a swing because you're supposed to go to church on Sundays and all of that shit. And businessmen really did wear bowler hats and carry furled umbrellas. And
no sex, please, we're British.
That was the British way of life, and they didn't like it, particularly the police. The police loved the status quo to be exactly as it was, and they were on the take, you know, the porn squad, the obscene publication squad. In the end, in the corruption trials in the early 70s, they had to disband the entire thing, and they've never reformed it.
This area in particular, which, you know, Soho, so at that time, as you pointed out earlier, you know, was sort of the Vice district, but it was run by the Vice squad, effectively.
It was.
Wasn't it?
It was. They wrote some of the books, the dirty books, and they used to go on holiday to Torremolinos and stuff. The head of the obscene publication squad was with the guy who had the most warehouses of porn around the corner here on Romilly Street. No, it was absolutely blatant.
They got all that porn stuff going on in the kind of underworld, which the police are complicit in, and yet the underground, in the counterculture, they were desperate to squash it, weren't they? And by the way, it was a hopeless endeavour to try and get through your counterculture life in 1 hour, so we're not going to bother. Let's go back to what you were referring to then, the countercultural feeling, because what's always of interest to me is to try and understand how young people, you, were feeling about society and about change, about transformation, about how things could be, rather that kind of countercultural spirit which binded this, as you called it, this constituency together.
We were the first generation to be better educated. I mean, both my parents left school at 14 And the same applied to a lot of my friends. Their parents, they'd not read any books. They didn't have many ideas. They just went along with what the ordinary culture was about. We basically had to look around for mentors. And our mentors were everybody from the Thelonious Monk and Charlie Parker and bebop guys, right through to the Beat Generation writers, Ginsberg and Burroughs and Kereouc and everybody. Electronic music was very big, 12-tone and all the more experimental stuff coming out of Europe, going right back to the 20s. In fact, weird literature, particularly postmodern, and modernist stuff, beginning with James Joyce and all of those kind of people. People who had been regarded as pretty edgy back in the 50s and 60s. It was like a supermarket of ideas. You've got everything, the Hells Angels on one end, right through to the Hare Krishnas on the other, and everything in between. You could pick and choose. And that's really what it was all about. There was no overall plan. There were no leaders or anything like that. Although there were quite a few alpha males in America who wanted to lead everything. But there was very little in that way in Britain, actually. It was much more, here it all is, to just get on with it.
But you had a sense, without it being organised in any way, theorised or kind of written up as a sort of conscious ideology, there was this feeling of being on the brink of something, that something having this extraordinary potential to change things. That was a shared feeling of in some way, was it?
Yes, because the whole movement was, generally speaking, not very consumerist, much more concerned with people's human feelings and relationships with each other. And we need to think, make love, not war. And of course, the sexual attitudes, particularly within the underground, were what would now be regarded as quite extraordinarily liberal, really. I think that there's been a move back to much more conservative views. There was a great deal of sex and a belief that this was part of a friendship, was to have sex with somebody. It wasn't a lifelong commitment. You didn't have to be married. It was just a way of expressing friendships. By no means everybody was into that, and some people were coerced into it. A lot of women, I think, got badly treated. There's no question about that. But also, it was the first time that the idea of women having their own sexual drive was pretty much allowed. Up until then, they're supposed to not to be neutral, really, just some kind of male plaything, they had no sex life of their own. Whereas that was the great thing of people like Germaine Greer and the women who then, in the very early 70s, started Spare Rib and everything. They were finally asserting the fact that, yes, they were sexual human beings themselves. Germaine's celebration of groupies and everything, which of course a lot of people misunderstand these days, but was a positive thing back then.
And you also got, I suppose, the beginnings of gay liberation, other more political things as well going on.
Oh yeah, very much so. It was pretty much cause specific. I mean, you could say people were left wing, but the Labour Party, of course, approached us many times to try and get IT allied with the Labour Party, but there was just a cultural gap there. Most people would have supported them, and most people voted for them. There was just no connection culturally. On the other hand, a huge number of the people that we knew were gay. I mean, obviously, it was just an accepted thing. Jack Henry Moore, who was the second editor of IT, was gay, for instance. Half the people, Ginsberg, Burroughs, it was a gay scene. And don't forget, it was illegal up until 1967.
Right.
You had to be a bit careful. When IT was busted, I think the third time or second time, was again small ads looking for gay partners. And this was after it had been made legal, but it was legal only if you were over 21.
Right.
And I think the ads didn't specify that, or I forget now. It was in court for ages. I missed most of that, though. I was living in America by then.
We covered it last time. You'd got towards the end of the 60s. You'd done all this stuff. Indica with Better Book, putting on these huge events, and you were basically getting worn out, weren't you? You were the lifestyle getting to you, isn't it? And it was kind of Ginsberg, in a sense, who sort of pulled you out of that. That's what we talked about last time.
He did. Well, the end of '69, really. I think everybody felt like that. I think it might have been McCartney in an interview once. He just said, nobody had had enough sleep for years. Everybody had taken too many drugs. Everyone was just completely exhausted. That's why there was quite a big movement to communes in the country and into nature and stuff to try and recuperate, because we were all totally worn out. I certainly was, and Ginsberg very kindly... he didn't make up the job was there, but he wanted somebody to catalogue his tape archive. And he had hundreds upon hundreds of tapes of readings. At that point, I had already just done a whole series of spoken word albums for the Beatles' experimental label called Zappa. So he knew that I knew how to edit tapes and do all that kind of thing, as well as running the bookshop and having an editorial and writing role in IT. There was all the music side of things, because International Times, by its very nature, wasn't sold by W.H. Smiths or anybody. They absolutely boycotted us. So we were sold by street vendors. We would give them 100 copies, and if they didn't come back with the money, then they didn't get any more. But most of them did. They would be sold to Holland, and then the guys who used to take them to Holland realised, we could take passengers, and that turned into a bus company that took hippies to Amsterdam every week. And all these kind of spin-offs were going on. But IT itself, it did get some ads, but not that many. It got record company ads after I started interviewing, McCartney and Lennon and Harrison and everybody. Jagger and Townsend. I mean, everybody wanted to be in it.
You mean the underground figures wanted to be in it, and that sort of brought in some sort of advertising?
Yes, it did. Yeah. We made sure that the staff got some money by having the UFO club. And Joe Boyd and Hoppy started UFO. Joe booked all the bands, and Hoppy did all the administration. And the entire staff of International Times worked the club, basically. They were on the door, they were security, they were backstage, and lighting and all that. And that gave them a regular income. And of course, because it was an underground outfit, I mean, the house band was the Pink Floyd and Soft Machine and Arthur Brown. Yeah, and some of those bands went on to do big things. I mean, Procol Harum did their second ever gig at the UFO Club. And 2 weeks later, they were in the charts. The whole life seemed to be like an endless party going on. I mean, I'd come down in the morning, there'd be people sleeping on the floor. It was quite chaotic.
Tell us about the 14-hour Technicolour Dream as well.
Well,
that's the fundraiser, isn't it?
Yes, that was after we got busted, when the police took everything away. Hoppy and Dave Howson and a few other people probably took time off from IT and put on this big fundraising event at the Alexandra Palace, which holds thousands and thousands of people. And I think we had 41 bands there. Which is so many that you couldn't have them all. Even though it ran all night, there would still be too many. So there was a band at each end. And there was this strange neutral zone in the middle where they cancelled each other out. And you'd get hippies standing there like with a bemused look on their face, like leaning one way and then leaning the other way.
On my left ear I've got Pink Floyd, and my right ear I've got...
Well, they arrived at dawn. Right. I mean, it was very dramatic. Sid was on acid, and they were just beneath the big rose window in Ali Pali. And just as the sun came pouring through, they launched into interstellar overdrive, and just one of those great psychedelic moments. John Lennon was there. I mean, all kinds of people were there and wandering around.
Yoko was doing a sort of...
Yoko, clothes cut off by the audience and things like that. There was somebody in an igloo that was giving people dried banana skins, which is supposed to make you high or something. That was a fad for about 10 days.
It all spirals up or down for you, Miles, and I think we can leapfrog the time on the farm with Ginsberg because we covered that. But I think when after that, of course, you go out to Berkeley and live with him again, and with Sue in a commune, and use your life in America and all sorts of other things. We haven't talked about the Chelsea Hotel, and then of course
I did live in the Chelsea for a few years.
Yeah, and then your whole life as a music journalist as well. Completely different era with the Clash and all that sort of stuff. But I think for today, Miles, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Well, it's always a pleasure.
Will you come back?
Of course.
Thanks so much to Miles. A hopeless endeavour, of course, to try and squeeze his countercultural life into an hour. I'm not quite sure why I even thought that was possible. I will ask him to come back to talk about his crazier life in some ways, in the 70s and on into the 80s. In March next year, we are curating an exhibition together about Ginsberg in London, drawn mainly from Miles's own collection of ephemera and images and sounds, but it's also going to include some very, very special guests. Top secret at the moment, but I hope to announce that very soon. He's very sweet, very funny, and I think very modest considering all the things that he's done and all those that he's known. Thank you to you for listening and to everybody who's written in with suggestions. We love it. Keep them coming. I hope to cover a lot more stuff that's been suggested in 2024. Just one show left this year. Countercultural Christmas show. I think it's going to land actually on winter solstice, which happens to be my birthday. If anybody wants to send me a birthday present, I'm very happy to receive it. I did receive a t-shirt from Ronnie Lambert, who is one of my regular correspondents. It's a very funny t-shirt. Maybe I'll take a photograph of me wearing it, although it's huge. I don't know how big Ronnie thinks I am, but it could fit a whole countercultural happening inside it. Thanks, Ronnie. So let's finish with this real Tuesday Well song written for my guest today, Miles. It's called Miles. See you next time, down the road, around the bend, for more tales from the underground and the other side.